Following the gruesome discovery of over 2,000 preserved baby remains at an abortionist's home, many are asking how such a horrific thing could happen. But the case is not unique. Late-term abortionist Ulrich Klopfer died last month. His family then contacted the coroner's office about possible baby remains at his Illinois home and to request proper removal. Upon arrival to the property, authorities discovered 2,246 preserved baby remains. Some have drawn comparisons to this discovery to the notorious late-term Philadelphia abortionist Kermit Gosnell, who also kept preserved baby remains. Gosnell was convicted in 2013 of killing 3 infants born alive after botched abortions, as well as the involuntary manslaughter of an adult patient and for performing abortions beyond Pennsylvania's 24-week limit. Joining us now is someone who became an expert on the Kermit Gosnell case, Anne McElhinney. Anne was a producer of the film Gosnell, the Trial of America's Biggest Serial Killer. She also co-wrote the book Gosnell, the Untold Story of America's Most Prolific Serial Killer. Anne, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much, Catherine.
Absolutely. And first off, what was your initial reaction when you saw the news about the baby remains on Klopfer's property?
Well, I mean, as you can imagine, I mean, the first thing I thought about was Gosnell. I mean, it's bizarre, actually. The similarities, the fact, and what immediately struck out to me was that they were medically preserved, you know, that he had gone to quite a bit of trouble, that in fact, and I mean, you know, lots of thoughts came to my mind. Obviously, I thought of the feet, the remains of the children that were kept in jars that Gosnell had done. So I was immediately struck by the fact that he medically preserved them. And, you know, the question, obviously, loads of questions emerge about how, I mean, there's so many questions, like this is his home. So he's living, you know, he has a wife. How did this happen? And obviously subsequent stories have emerged that these remains date from 2 decades ago. How any of this is possible, what happened to these children? Where did they come from? Who are the mothers? Who are the fathers? It's an extraordinary story. And of course, obviously very, very reminiscent of what happened with Kermit Gosnell. It's extraordinary.
You're right. We're just beginning to see the investigation into this. There are more questions than answers at this point. Are there other similarities or differences between Klopfer and Gosnell that you've noticed already?
Well, I think that, I mean, it appears that he also was under scrutiny from the authorities occasionally. And that he had flaunted many rules, you know, that are already in place, but again had been successful in continuing on despite them. So, you know, what I think is important that comes out of this story is again the fact that, you know, this idea when Gosnell first emerged, and people like yourself who highlighted that story, and obviously very few people in the mainstream media who highlighted the question emerged, like first of all, how did he get away with it for so long? But the bigger question right now is, you know, is the question of oversight. You know, how was it when there were questions about this guy, when there were questions about Kermit Gosnell, repeated questions, and the death, obviously, of 2 women, Samika Shaw and Carnamaya Monger, that no one in the Department of Health in Pennsylvania decided to investigate? Similarly, with this case, we see a very, very similar thing where many questions were asked about this guy, who was the biggest abortion provider in the state of Indiana, and yet, you know, he kept operating. You know, he kept operating with impunity for forever. You know, the secondary question here is how the media have covered this story since it emerged. And the answer is, of course, like very, very similar to Gosnell. They haven't. There's an incredible incuriosity among journalists when it comes to stories like this, which highlight abortion, by the way. The real problem with covering this story properly and doing it the job that journalists should do is that it really highlights the humanity of the children. And no one wants that. That's the last thing you want. If you're if you're someone who supports the abortion industry or someone who is profiting from the abortion industry, the last thing you want to do is to bring attention to the humanity of the children. You know, in the case of Gosnell, 47 children's remains were found on the clinic. And by the way, of those 47, only I think it was 2 or 3 could be deemed to have been killed illegally. So you know, and I've seen all the bodies, and what is striking is the idea that those children were, you know, disposed of legally, that they were legally dispatched from this world through a process called abortion. This is, you know, The value of stories like this, is highlighting the humanity of the children, and I just wish the media would pay attention.
And you are such an expert on Gosnell, and I know you've interviewed him a number of times in prison. Did you get any insight into how someone becomes so hardened that they are committing such heinous acts?
My experience now with the abortion industry and interviewing quite a number of people involved is there's a lot of greed involved. And then there's the God complex, which I think is very true in Kermit Gosnell's case, where he loved the control he had over these very poor and vulnerable communities and people that he came across. And he loved that control. And I think for somebody, with psychopathic tendencies, as Gosnell obviously has, this is the perfect place for you. And who is this guy? Here we have, I love that thing where, I've heard this so often about Gosnell. He's an outlier. Well, these stories seem to be piling up. You cover them all the time on EWTN, which as one network that covers these stories properly. This is not an isolated. Gosnell was not isolated even from the get-go. And since him, these stories are mounting up all the time. When eventually will people start to say, no, actually, these aren't outliers. This is actually very telling of the industry that's out there, an unregulated industry, an industry that doesn't, have to, subscribe to any of the rules that any other medical facilities subscribe to, because they get away, basically, literally, with murder in a very supportive environment.
And it will not leave our news cycle. Anne McElhinney, producer of Gosnell, the trial of America's biggest serial killer. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Catherine.